head of the philosophy department at the University of Connecticut, where he also holds affiliate appointments in a variety of programs: Judaic Studies, Caribbean and Latinx Studies, Asian and Asian American Studies, Women's, Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Global Studies. Dr. Gordon's research in philosophy again spans a broad spectrum from Africana to existence, phenomenology, social and political philosophy, the philosophy of culture, race, racism, aesthetics, the philosophy of education, philosophy of science and technology, philosophy of human sciences, of psychiatry, philosophy of medicine, and psychoanalysis. He's a very widely published scholar with very many books to his credit, including Freedom, Justice, and Decolonization, published by Routledge in 2021. Dr. Gordon, welcome to the forum, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And in these times, I guess the floor is metonymic of the screen. But yes, here we are. For those of you who are curious, you may notice that the name that pops up is Jane Gordon. And what it is I quickly came downstairs to set up with the better mic and also the Ethernet cable. And I brought the computer down that has the Zoom link that's linked into Jane Gordon's account, which is why the name is there. However, I take it that at the level of technology and artificial intelligence, there is a form of resistance to the patriarchal adage that if you get married, you become one, and that is the man. And so in this instance, I'm very happy to become the woman. And Jane Gordon is one hell of a woman, so I'm very proud to be her. The other thing I'd like to say is my condolences to everybody who has lost folks over the past year, just period, actually. More than 500K dead from the COVID-19 pandemic. But even without the pandemic, what many people don't understand about death, because there are people always dying for varieties of reasons. But I think what comes to the fore with the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's particularly stark, and especially when we see that within just even weeks of having an administration that has competence and a reduction of malfeasance, that literally who leads makes a difference of life and death. And what many people don't understand as well when we say death is that death within our species is something we understand as a loss of the irreplaceable. There are those, if we don't have that memory, that retention, that connection, that way in which we can bring in our relationships with each other, something in which our fellow human being is not expendable, then we understand that in that loss is a transformation of our life. We've lost a world. We live simultaneously with goals and losses. So to all of you, I extend my condolence. I also begin with Hotep, Shalom, Salam Alaikum, Halito, Machia Vanakam, Ujambo. And those are different languages. They range from ancient Medu-Neter, which is just ancient East African language that was spoken by the people of Kemet that you know as Egypt. And all Medu-Neter just means is divine speech. All the way through to Hebrew, which some of you are familiar. If I say Salam Alaikum, Assalamu Alaikum, it's Arabic. But when I said Machia Vanakam, I was speaking in Tamil. And of course, It's very important in the United States. This is a settler society. There are so many people on whose land we stand, but I picked one with whose language I'm familiar, and it was Choctaw. And so there were all those ways of saying hello, but it's also striking that those many ways to say hello come down to peace. It's striking already that to greet another human being could take the form of saying peace. It means I'm not your enemy. And there are many ways to say I'm not your enemy. In some societies, the translation comes down to, I see you. And the response is, I see you too. So already there is a connection, a human connection, through which we begin to build the question of something very vital, which is how to live together, how to be in the world together. Now, my opening remarks was it would be wonderful to hear from a lot of you, for this to be a forum of exchange, is connected to the theme of a book I recently wrote, a book that just got published, and we're just having a wonderful conversation about the difficulties faced in finishing that book. Because in my case, it was finishing it in a situation of near incapacitation. But it really says something when one can barely function in the throes of COVID-19, where all images are quadrupled. There are these moments of pain so severe that one is dealing with the dreaded white light. There is the situation in which cognition, all of these things are going along, but yet I was writing, and I was finishing writing. And this is something that's very discomforting for many people in the academy, because, a lot of people talk about writing all the time, but, when all is said and done, there are people who write for professional goals, but there are people who write because it's their project. It's part of life. When you write, when you think, when you reach out with thought in that context, it is to live. It's part of living itself. And the thing about it that makes it even more complicated is that when we're thinking about ideas, even when we look at this forum right now, the thing that many people don't realize is only a tiny fragment of theory, of philosophy, of academic or of thought is actually written. Most of it is communicated, talked about. It's done like in forums like this. And this is crucial to bear in mind as we will speak, because one of the ways in which, say, African philosophy is attacked is through a stereotype. The stereotype is connected to writing. There's a tendency to refer to African philosophy, African thinking as oral. And it's referred to that in a deprecating way. But what's problematic about it is not simply the condescension and the factual error, because there are actually many African languages that are written. But the problem, of course, is that to defend African thought through appealing to the fact that it's written is a lot like trying to defend yourself if somebody walked up to you and say, have you stopped beating your wife? You see, because what is missed in the exchange is something about philosophy itself. Socrates never wrote a book, never wrote an article, not an essay. And in fact, most philosophy, the writings we have, I'm just picking the well-known Greek ones for now, Plato and Aristotle, those are fragments that survived. But it's not about the writing. You see, the writing is connected to a different project, but the thinking, the learning, the creativity, that is done in real time with living people, communicated, and they carry it on in memory, in speech, and only a tiny fragment makes its way in the form of ink to paper, or in this case, to the screen. This connects to another point when I was talking about hello. which is because, as you see right now, we're right now on a computer. Many of us are speaking with each other virtually, and it's because of a pandemic. But the thing about the pandemic is that safety from the pandemic, short of the vaccine itself, is physical distance. But it's a big mistake to confuse physical distance with social distance. See, neoliberalism wants us to say social distance because neoliberalism is antisocial. But you see, the thing to bear in mind is that all social means is to be connected to each other in a communicative practice. And that's as a consequence, you who are viewing right now could be from another side of the world physically, but as long as we're communicating, we're socially close. And as many of you know on the screen right now, it's possible to be physically close, but socially distant. Think of a failing marriage as an example. So the thing to bear in mind is that from the benefits of these technologies, we continue social closeness despite physical distance. And the reason that is important is connected to some of the themes we're talking about, such as decolonization. Because part of the colonization situation is not simply about guns and soldiers and putting people under the jurisdiction of others. Because the problem with that is if that's the only way you can do it, you'll have to be fighting people physically all the time. A more effective mechanism is to ensure that people have developed the practices of self-policing, of structuring even the very way they think, to be in a form that ultimately makes colonizing them easier. And among those is to set up a set of epistemic and normative practices that will maintain colonial relations by the very people who are colonized. And so this can happen at the level of knowledge, as we may see in the disciplines, but it could also happen even in terms of the way we use our language, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o points out. So if you think of a world of market commodification, we live in a world, for instance, in which colonization is a multifaceted practice. And that takes the form also of what we could call market colonization. Neoliberalism and neoconservatism are beholden to the god of the market. And that's why many of us don't even realize that even the language we use sometimes affirm the idea of a reduction of ourselves to market and commodified forces. You could look at this in a very simple example. First of all, I don't like the term universities. I prefer communities of advanced learning because the university, with this notion of singular or one voice that dates itself to Bologna, right, to late medieval, early Renaissance Italy, fails to address the fact that advanced learning communities go back more than 4,000 years. You could find them in South Asia, you could find them in East Africa. But in addition to that, there are other terms, even when we think of the Mediterranean, when you think of the concept in Greek like panepistemoi, which just means many knowledges, pan-knowledges. But the reason there was the university in that old form, the Bologna form, is connected to Christianity. And that's why those centers of learning began with seminaries, theological centers. Now, in the Euro-modern world, the movement was from the seminary to the arts and sciences. And that's one of the reasons why colleges of liberal arts and sciences tend to be the center of the Euro-modern university. But we're living into a new period of colonization. And I'm sure you all feel in it. Because the arts and sciences are being pushed to the side. And the business schools are becoming the new theological centers. And that's because more people are not talking about the knowledge of God or the knowledge of politics or the knowledge of nature or the knowledge of the market. More people are talking more now about the market of. And that's the new theological center. So there's the market of knowledge, the market of politics, the market of God. And now, of course, we're dealing with the very idea of the marketing of what we do as knowledge producers. So in Freedom, Justice, and Colonization, I get to the point with basically the three themes. So I'll just very quickly and then stop so we can get into the conversation. The first theme is that we're a society that loves to talk about freedom while developing rigorous methods of eliminating freedom. Freedom is actually a very scary thing for many people because where there's freedom, there's responsibility. But in market-dominated societies that are antipathetic to freedom, for instance, the sociality of our communicating at a physical distance is an expression of freedom, that we've overcome that boundary, but we've overcome it through connectedness. If you look carefully, the actual language in the rise of Euromodern capitalism is the language of liberty, not freedom. And liberty is not identical with freedom. Liberty just means the absence of constraint. But as many people know about the absence of constraint, the extreme of that is license, which is basically you can do whatever you want. But the problem is, if everybody just does whatever he or she wants, somebody's going to be harmed. And so the problem that we begin to discover with the libertarian model is that it's a model that has as its goal a life without responsibility. And that's one of the reasons why the radicalization of the market ultimately is nihilistic. It undermines the question of taking responsibility for the world in which we live, which is a world of social relations, a world of communication. And it's a world that also is a world of vulnerability. Because what happens with radicalization of communication is that although we're at a distance, the location of connection is intimately connected inside the self. There's always intimacy in communication. But the other thing about the libertarian model, it can be said very concretely. I'll give the analogy of a person who escapes from prison. You can escape from prison and have liberty, the fugitive, but you don't have freedom because you cannot appear in public as legitimate. And this is why when many people escape from prison, it's always easy to catch them because they always try to get home. Why do they do that? The cops are waiting there. And of course, it's because home is an allegory of freedom. It's not that when your home becomes a place of unfreedom, it's when it's no longer a home because it's a place of abuse. But you see, a home properly is a place in which you belong, which means you can express yourself as who you are, and you're responsible for it. And so the question, there is a distinction between freedom and liberty. And freedom, and this is something observed in much of philosophy, this is not exclusive to people like Rousseau or Hegel or Marx. You can find it in Surya Aurobindo. You could find it there in ideas all the way from Zara Yacob to, you can find it in ancient Egyptian philosophy in the concept of Ma'at, okay? You could find it in Zen Buddhist philosophy. You could see it in the thought of Nishitani. And this is one of the conundrums of human reality, that we share with the animals a desire for liberty. But what distinguishes us from the animals is the responsibility over that liberty. We don't use the term, the lion murdered the antelope. You see? But we're at a point where we have even transcended ethical responsibility from the question of killing each other, homicide, to developing ethics that even make they're human beings who choose to be vegetarians because of imputing, connecting an ethical responsibility to our relationship to other species. So freedom always brings along with it ethical responsibility. But there's something even more with freedom, because freedom brings along with it the question of responsibility over power. And power is the ability to make things happen with access to the conditions of doing so. That is what leads to the political dimension of freedom. Because freedom, and this is where I talk about this a lot in the book, this is where right now we're dealing with the reality of what it is to be 8 billion people on this planet, and the political responsibility of access to the conditions of the possibility and extraordinary power of being able to destroy all life on this planet. And so this question of freedom is more than the question of whether we want to do what we want. It's a profound question of what it is to be responsible for life itself, all the way through to the anonymous. And so I said freedom, justice, and decolonization. Justice, then the obvious problem that follows from this is that many of us treat justice in a very colonial way. We treat justice almost as if it's a kind of gift from modern society, from Europeans, which is complete BS. The reality is that what has happened has been a colonization of the very concept of justice, because there's a presupposition that justice is such a universal concept that the ideas from many other societies that are not European societies have to be subsumed under that normative concept. And we just look for isomorphic terms that would bring them into the ambit of the universal. But what I show in the book is that actually the way we talk about justice in Euro-modern societies is a subset of a broader normative way in which other societies have talked about responsibility for life itself. Whether it's Mayat in ancient Kemet or Egypt, which is not just about the balancing through which you have justice. Mayat, expressed metaphorically, is a goddess of balance, but it's also about truth. It's also about life, but it's also, and this is no understanding at the time of COVID, breath. And so if you look even with ancient Greek concepts like dikaiosyne, again, many people under Euromodernity would just translate it as justice. But dikaiosyne is more like Mayat. It's broader than justice. So this begins to, you could see what I'm getting at. If you try to yoke freedom to liberty, you're constraining human possibility. If you try to constrain the normative world simply to the received conception of justice, it's the same problem. So I actually argue there's a need for decolonization of normative life, because we have accepted a set of norms that are actually more at home, that are more indigenous to a Euro-modern capitalist colonial society. And we imagine we're in a world in which those normative concepts are separate from the maledictions of that society. So if we could just apply those normative concepts better, we can be happy and free. But we never ask ourselves whether those very concepts we're trying to apply may be the problem themselves. That there is a way in which we have just accepted normative life that may be the very production of the forms of antipathy to life with which we're struggling. So that's why it leads to the question of decolonization. And I argue that the problem is that we fail to realize how radical the question of decolonization needs to be. That it's not simply a question about independence. If you look at many stories, many allegories of fighting for freedom, they culminate in a big outdoor party. Robin Hood and the Merry Men got rid of the sheriff and they party in the forest. Luke Skywalker and them knock out the Death Star, and then they have a party with the Wookiees or whatever they call them. And the list goes on. There's a big party, but if the camera keeps going, you know what everybody says after the party? This is a great party, but I got to go home. And this tells you something. Humanity needs a home. So the question is, home is not simply about a physical domicile. Home is actually the varieties of practices through which we're able to flourish and embody our humanity. So home can be the disciplinary practices. What disciplines are there in which you're at home? They could be the political relationships that are cultivated through which people are able to cultivate better relationships. This radical question of a radical critique begins to make us realize that our task is much grander than we may realize. And I don't mean grand in the imperial sense. I mean grand in the sense of an infinite task of reaching forth for the cultivation of a healthy life. So I'm going to close with just an example of something that's early stated in the book. Because what I do in the book is begin with a discussion of philosophy in Africana philosophy. And I say without reservation, I am not a disciplinary nationalist. I have a PhD in philosophy, but I never write as a philosopher. Right? There are many people tell you more about the discipline to which they belong than to tell you about the world or to explore ideas. And I found it very unhealthy to start with a form of presumption that philosophy is the answer to everything. That's a form of epistemological arrogance. I take the position that philosophy, any discipline we work in, is like a key that opens a door to other doors, to more disclosure. And all philosophy is, for me, from my training, was a point of departure that enabled me to have conversations with anthropology, sociology, economics, physics, biology, the list goes on, and in some cases develop new disciplines, precisely because once we realize that a discipline is not a God, is not a creation by God, but it's actually a condition, the way I talked about power, a condition of possibility, then it means that even within the discipline, we have to be careful that some of the subfields in the discipline become arrogant and construct themselves as the entirety of the discipline. And so when I looked at philosophy and Africana philosophy, I explored the fact that there are certain colonial epistemological prejudices about how to talk about philosophy. And there are many I talk about in the book, and not just in the book, in a lot of my writings. But I'll just close with one example. I'm teaching a course right now called Africana. I've created an Africana philosophy doctoral course that can be taken for more than one semester. And this semester, because the first time it's being taught at UConn, I decided, since it can be taken more than once, to start with the problem of philosophy of history and the history of philosophy. And the reason I decided to do that is because there are certain things many people just take for granted about the historical construction of knowledge that are just simply false. And I already began with one of them, which is the presuppositions about how the way people think of ancient thought. So I begin the course with a very simple example. And I do this in all my courses, actually, even my undergraduate courses. In the syllabus, I put a translation, I put my translation of a fragment of philosophical work by Antef. I could pick others. I could pick Hebshit. I could pick, Akhenaten, Nefertiti. A lot of people don't think of Nefertiti as a philosopher, but she was. And but I put it this because it's short. It's a paragraph. And Antef basically outlines what a philosopher is, what a philosopher struggles with, and why a philosopher aims to be wiser than a sage. And sages, to my knowledge, are pretty wise. So you could see the radicality of self-critique there. But that's not the reason I put it. It's a good point of departure. But at the end, I put the date. And of course, the society that it's from is a society in which there are women philosophers. There are whole areas of science that are designated as science whose origin are in women. A lot of people don't know that the origins of mathematics were primarily by women thinkers. A lot of the greatest ancient mathematicians were female. A lot of people don't realize this. And what's going on here? But here's the thing for the students. They see the date. And the date of the letter from Antef is approximately 1900 BCE. Now, the reason that's important is because after we've discussed it, the students, when they meet someone who says philosophy began in ancient Attic society, Athens and the Ionians, 500 BCE, 2,500 years ago, the students know that is false. But they know it's false without a form of epistemic dependency. In other words, if I simply told them it's false, that is the fetishizing of the professor. Because they read, they could say, no, that is false because I have read the thought of an ancient African thinker from 1,000 years earlier. And that ancient African thinker in the fragment referred to ancient writings he read. So clearly there is work, philosophical thinking in that way is much more ancient than people thought. And my students are thus literate in the practice of thinking today in a critical way about the past. The crucial thing, of course, when one can do this, is that is already a decolonial practice. Because at that moment, they need to ask themselves, to what extent the way we think of ideas as handed down is mired in a presupposition that they're only authoritative if they're embodied in certain individuals versus others. And once we begin to realize the fallacy there, the fallacy of the idea that it can only be from people who are white or European, they also learn something else. And I close with this. I always begin my classes with a conversation on what are students and professors. And students invariably describe professors the way they imagine professors as people who are to walk down from the mountain like Moses with the tablets. And I often, then I give my 2 cents. I said, well, what I see a professor as is a person who fell in love with learning and as a consequence continued to learn. That's why we do a thing called research. It's not to go find more tablets. It's for a practice of continued learning because we're lifelong students. And so a student is simply a beginning student with an advanced student. But because the beginning student comes to the room with a very different, or the screen, with different experiences from the advanced student, the student, although beginning, may bring an experience that the advanced student did not account for, which is why every one of us know this. Professors are always learning from our students. And it's not in a sense that our students have to be arrogant or anything, or we arrogant. It's just that when you understand the classroom or the institution of higher learning as a mutual learning community, you're learning together. And in that process, that is a decolonial epistemic practice. Because out of that, that relationships builds new relationships of learning. And together, we begin to engage in the commitment of building something which, if it takes the form of writing or recording, will put us in a conversation with people we, in some cases, will never meet and thus will never know. So ultimately, the radical political act of freedom, praxis, and decolonial practices of knowledge ultimately reach to those who are among the anonymous. And they were for whom we may one day be anonymous as ancestors. If we do our work right, so to speak, I do the scare quotes, it means their relationship to us is not one of traumatic overcoming, but one of appreciated flourishing. And I'll stop there.
Okay, is this where I step in?
Let me step in, Sally, then I'll hand over to you. Okay, Louis, thank you very much for this interesting conversation. Let me ask you a couple of, let's enter into a conversation. I'm going to be drawing on your book, what you have just said, and I'll also link up with our previous conversations before the session formally began. What does disciplinary decadence mean? Because that's one of the terms that you use, which some people in the audience might not be familiar with. And how does that link up with the notion of reality?
Disciplinary decadence is a form of, oh, I'm sorry, Sinfree, you may want to turn off your mic because it creates an echo when I speak.
Okay.
Disciplinary decadence is a form of disciplinary bad faith. And what it is when the discipline is treated as if created by a God, it treats itself as complete. And as a consequence of treating itself as complete, it begins simply to be auto-reflectively looking at itself. And thus it turns away from that which transcends itself. And that then what happens is it fetishizes itself and it fetishizes its methods. We see some of this in the academy when some of us may publish things and there are people interested not in what we say, not whether it's true, they just want to know if we followed the method. And that's the fetishizing of method. There are some people, this takes a form in which there's not a conversation that transcends the discipline, where they could be learning from other disciplines. And as a consequence, there's a form of purification practice. And thus, there are things outside the discipline that are not cited or learned from, again, because it's trying to treat itself as complete. And what eventually happens is that we fail to understand that disciplines are created by human beings with the imperfections of human beings, and thus require the communicative practices in order to go beyond it. Now, reality is that beyond. So one of the things about reality is that reality is a form of transcending activity. You notice I use the present participle, transcending, not transcendence, as if it's fixed. And that's because in all disciplinary practices, we're producing meaning. And this is one of the reasons why in that effort to communicate properly with other disciplines, we may create new disciplines. And there are many examples of this. An example is eugenics, right? Eugenics is something that attempted to close things off by a closure of meanings, but then genetics began to undermine eugenics because in order to do it properly, one has to have a communication with everything from semiotics to mathematics to biology. But beyond those, there are questions of how one can deal even with theoretical areas such as mathematics. To give you an example, where I said earlier, I don't start from a disciplinary identity. And because of that, I look at the problem and see what resources I need to tackle that problem, to deal with it. Well, it means that I have to accept the fact that philosophy alone would be insufficient. Some people, when they don't accept that their discipline by itself is insufficient, they do another act that's part of disciplinary decadence. When that which exceeds the discipline fails to match their presumptions, their response is to say something is wrong with it. So if you pick human science as an example, there are people who study subordinated populations or racially degraded populations, say Black people as an example. And if Black people don't fit the paradigms of the disciplinary expectations, the logical response should be perhaps the paradigms are epistemologically limited and need to be transformed. But what has happened historically has been a response of a form of narcissistic rage. The response is, what's wrong with these people that they don't fit? And so there's an effort, as Du Bois would point out, to squeeze the people into discipline. That's what Fanon pointed out as well, to squeeze the people into the discipline, instead of adjust the discipline to the reality that the people exceed the discipline. Now, this is an insight, by the way, that goes all the way back to 1885 in Antonin Firmin on the equality of the races. Antonin Firmin argues that human science, no human being fits into one science. For the human sciences to, you have to use the plural, for the human sciences to work, you need to deal with the multi-dimensions of how human existence manifests itself, which means a proper human scientist will have to be multiversal in methodological approaches. And even in that, will be dealing with a few dimensions of human reality, because there's not a whole to human reality, precisely because human reality, as that which can question its reality, is always transcending it. Now, that insight then gives you an idea. Now, just very quickly, what I argue is a way of dealing with disciplinary decadence is what I do, not only that, but with all my writings. I argue that we need to have a teleological suspension of disciplinarity. It means that to conduct research in a healthy way, you must be willing to transcend your discipline for the sake of reality. And this is one of the reasons why innovations, communication, radical growth, transformation, creativity, that comes from those who have disciplinary humility instead of disciplinary arrogance.
I have a couple of other questions, but let me hand over to Sally and then open the conversations, and I'll come back and comment later on. Sally, you wanted to jump in.
Okay, first of all, thank you simply for the honor and distinction of having been invited to ask the first question. We already asked the first question. And also, thank you very much, Professor Gordon, for a very exciting, stimulating, and informative presentation. I am a linguist, and yesterday I was very happy to start reading your work, and very impressed by the clarity of your presentation and the very careful choice of terms. And I was very much impressed by the term epistemic dependency in the context of decolonizing knowledge. It reminded me of the title of a book by Bonaventure de Santos, The End of the Cognitive Empire. And there, from there, you went on to clarify the notions of colonization as opposed to coloniality, decolonization, decoloniality, and how subtle some of the differences are. And this morning, when I heard you start, from the outset, present the notion of market of knowledge, it really resonated very well. It reminded me of the literature on globalization. And we think of the free market, but is there really a free market? Because in the market, there are people who control the terms of trade, the exchange of commodity and so forth. But what is particularly rich for me with the term market of knowledge is that we can think of all of us as scholars, as participants in the market, as traders, and we have to think of what we are trading, and we have to think of whether we are acting more as consumers than as producers, and as producers of knowledge, we have to think of how we sell our commodities, our ideas and so forth, and engage in the exchange of ideas. Okay. Do we too easily become content when our alternative ideas are dismissed, or do we fight harder because we have very legitimate reasons for suggesting alternative ideas? And this is what I really saw in your book. Why should we continue thinking that knowledge started with Europe, that knowledge, the history of knowledge ends in Europe? I found it really very thought-provoking, because as you go on to relate what has developed in Europe to what had already emerged in Egypt and so forth, and we realize the history of mankind is much longer than the colonization of the rest of the world by Europe since the 15th century. And if we, as we read other literature, we also realize that knowledge in Europe benefited greatly from the interactions of Europe with the rest of the world. And this is particularly interesting in the case of medicine. A lot of what we consider modern medicine now, which is associated with progress of knowledge in Europe, actually came from South Asia through Islam. And then the colonization of Iberia by the Arabs, which spread a lot of modern practices that Europeans have adopted. And so, you know, what has also struck me as a person who in his own discipline has been challenging a lot of received ideas about how languages of the global South are interpreted, how they are analyzed, what are the conclusions that have been hastily drawn, for instance, regarding the endangerment of languages. One of my points has been the modes of coexistence and competition between indigenous languages and European languages in Africa have not been the same as those of the coexistence and competition of between the indigenous languages and European languages in the Americas and Australia and things like that. And it's so rewarding to hear you connect these two with the notion of responsibility. As Asians in the market of knowledge, we are happy to be able to participate in this market. So, and especially scholars like myself and Cynthia and others who have had the privilege, should I speak of privilege? But maybe of becoming part of the academia in the Western world. To what extent are we assuming our responsibility of voicing and marketing our alternative analysis of the realities that we are exposed to, that we are analyzing? So it's also so gratifying to hear you question the notion of universals. Speaking of universals, it comes with particular parameters, with particular standards. And the question is, who has set up the standards? Who has defined those parameters and so forth? And for those of us from the global South, there is another sense of responsibility. And I was happy to hear you speak of the history of philosophy as opposed to the philosophy of history. Because in any discipline, there must be a history of the scholarship in that discipline. And in the case of us studying languages, we have to remember Europeans colonized us in the global South, and they started studying indigenous languages in the global South, not necessarily because they wanted to understand the languages of the global South better, but also because they wanted to use the knowledge that they were constructing from a European perspective to control the global South. And for instance, they redefined ethnicity in the global South based on languages, and they group us in different ways, and some of these ways must be disputed and so forth. And Sinfi, in his work with his colleague, have invited us to re-examine some of these notions, because in some cases, languages are artificial constructions of the Western world. And we bear the responsibility of revisiting that history and questioning it and putting things in perspective. So, Sinfi, you invited me to ask the first question. I'm sorry, I don't have a question. I'm so impressed by the presentation and by the scholarship of Dr. Gordon, that all I had to do is just add these comments, because in the spirit of interdisciplinarity, which I really endorse, I thought I would present a perspective from linguistics. I was disappointed that I didn't hear you listing in the disciplines you were mentioning, Dr. Gordon. But in that spirit, I think you have just underscored why we have to cross our disciplinary boundaries and talk to each other, because there are ways in which we can collaborate together in the spirit of knowledge decoloniality and colonization of knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sally. I think that was very helpful, your connection, the connections you were making between what Louis was talking about and issues that arise in linguistics. Magda, do you want to ask Gordon, do you want to respond, or do you want to wait for other people to jump in?
What I was going to say is I have a very unusual ability, which is I can process, it sounds very weird, but up to 75 questions. I have a very unusual memory. And I think it's important, since it's been recorded, for many people's questions to come out. Even if we run out of time, that would be very constructive. So as many people who want to ask, please do. And if there's time, I will respond, but I will process everyone. And some people have seen me do this before. They know I can do that.
Okay.
So so I'd much rather get to hear from everybody.
From you, okay. Do we have any questions? I was going to ask you about the geography of reason, what exactly that meant and how that is similar or different from notions about the global South. So that's one of my other questions. Magda, do you want to ask if anybody has any questions?
I see that Susan Cote van Roy wrote a comment in the chat box, and then there is an intervention from Gabriel Nascimento. So I'm going to start with Susan's comments, and then Gabriel, and then Diane, and Sangeeta Bhagagupta as well. So the comment that Susan makes is that she struggles with the increasing creep of the health discipline as dominant discourse and yardstick for doing ethical research together with human beings. I think thinking of the health discipline as possibly being in a phase of disciplinary decadence. This assists me to understand my discomfort with this phenomenon. And then, Gabriel, would you like to ask a question and make your comment now?
Thank you, Rafael. Thank you. So, me and Rafael, we have both relationship because of Limario's presence now live. I think Professor Limario was my advisor. So I'm so happy because I'm here with you, and I can have this kind of talk with Professor Gordon. In fact, your work is very present in Brazil, thanks to our discussion now on what Fanon said about colonization and racism, and because more recently we've been discussing the power of humanism for language and languages. For this case, for example, on how language presupposes the way we racialize Black bodies. And I think your commitment to this kind of discussion on freedom and independence comes to make me think about a lot of questions we've been pointing to in Brazil. That's about how we, of course, I'm speaking from Southern Bahia and Southern University in Southern Bahia. And we've been speaking about curriculum or discipline when we try to speak about how to not be tied or bound to this discipline here. But the problem is we are in a Black country with white people dominating and white people in power, in charge. And the problem is this is new for us when we have to speak about what comes to be independence. So the voices coming from the Caribbean and from Fanon are here to make us know somehow that we have to survive phantoms, or we have to survive what racism is in case of how it stimulates, for example, what we can see. So for you, in your opinion, Professor Gordon, how we can deal with this way we look at languages as the way they racialize Black bodies, and how we are treating this or dealing with this when we think about language is only a means to represent, for example, struggles. And of course, when we have languages racializing Black bodies, languages are not only to represent racism. It's not a way, in my opinion, of course, a way to represent racism, such as it's portraying racism. And language, modern languages were constructed as a means to imagine Black bodies were not bodies of language. And as you speak about Africana studies, we have much to learn from Africana studies, not only through the lens of philosophy or linguistics in the Western world, and how we think about this kind of philosophy, but for example, here in Bahia, we had strikers coming from Bento speaking groups in 1789. And of course, we don't know about it, but we have a lot to listen to this history and these folks, because we don't know what it means to deal with slavery, not being a slave, because I don't realize I'm a slave, even if you speak I'm a slave. So this is linked, of course it's linguistics, but we are quite narrowed and limited in linguistics to speak about this nowadays, because we don't have these voices that were murdered throughout history. So in your opinion, how we can look at languages for this discussion? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriel. And if I may, I will now read the comment that Sangeeta wrote in the chat. Thanks for a very interesting start. I would like to hear you discuss creolized hybrid further. And then I will hand over the digital floor to Diane A. Larson-Freeman.
Thank you, Raphael. Let me join the others and thank you for your comments. Jane Lewis Gordon. I found it a very stimulating talk so far. I'm a linguist, applied linguist, and I take some inspiration from Sally's comments and presence because we have cited each other in our common interest in something called complexity theory. And my question revolves around something another linguist, and the distinction another linguist has made, Michael Halliday, between interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. And he makes the claim, and I cited it widely because I agree with it, that if you're interdisciplinary, the disciplinary decadence of what you speak, if you're interdisciplinary, you still have disciplinary boundaries. It's still a question of trying to build bridges between them, but the territory has been staked, right? There's already a definition of a discipline that erects certain boundaries, and you have to break those down. He suggests that what we should be thinking about is a transdisciplinary perspective, where we get beyond the disciplinary boundaries. And he says that's where new ideas emerge. That's where actual good creative thinking takes place. And he cites as examples systems thinking, complexity theory. So of course I cite it because that's my interest. But anyway, I would like you to speak about that, the difference between interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary, if that's a familiar concept. And it seems to me that, at least in part, is perhaps an answer to disciplinary decadence. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane Larson Freeman. Actually, I don't argue for this interdisciplinarity. I argue for transdisciplinarity. Actually, I've been arguing it since the 90s. It was actually preceded him with that, and a few others did too. And the thing we point out, you may notice that the way I talked about sociality is about communicative practices, but that and I argue that one must transcend one's discipline. The problem with many models of interdisciplinarity is that they treat their disciplines like silos who they may meet in a space, but they don't actually communicate. And so that means that they're onto themselves and they're actually maintaining disciplinary decadence. So ironically, there is a form of interdisciplinary disciplinary decadence. This is why you notice I was very careful to say I don't start from the premise of what my disciplinary identity is, but look at the problem in a way in which people could meet around it. That's why, for instance, in my own career, there were many years before I even used the word philosopher, mainly because I used to start with the question of radical theory. And it meant I was open to learn from many disciplines. And I'm part of many disciplinary communities, so to speak. When I work with people in quantum mechanics or with when I enter the room with theoretical physics, I don't enter the room as a philosopher. I just enter the room with us looking at the problem and we just go at it. And it's a similar thing with many other communities. We don't start with that question of what is my discipline and your discipline, but what is it can we learn together about how to deal with this problem? And so I absolutely support that. And that's one of the reasons why I argued for a teleological suspension of disciplinarity. It means you suspend the question of your disciplinary identity, but the purpose, that's the teleological part, it's not big T teleology, but it's purpose teleology in the sense that you're looking at the wider problem, the social or the theoretical problem to deal with, and you're using whatever resources are available in a communicative practice. That's the transdisciplinarity at work. And when I was speaking with my response to Sinfree, that is a hint of the way I look at reality, because reality is always transcending. This is one of the reasons why I don't use universal, I use universalizing. And you see the difference, because if you're always going beyond yourself, you're reaching for more, but part of human reality is that it's never complete. And that's why you cannot have the way in logic, you could have a domain onto which you isomorphically impose a particular claim. So that's rejected, because of course, the moment you can raise that domain, you have transcended it, okay? So that's the first, so thank you for asking that question. That connects, that gave me the opportunity to mention this. Gabrielle, bon dia. You could probably tell. Bon dia. I spent a lot of time in not only in northern Brazil, but all over the country. I've been, but particularly Salvador. Spent a lot of time in Cachoeira. There's a whole complexity of the history there. A little shout out, if she ever sees this recording, to Rosamea da Silva, out there in Aracaju. And there's also, Fernando Brigato in Sao Leopoldo, and also my crew down in Sao Paulo and other places in Rio. And also the various indigenous communities with whom I work also in the Andes. So the point you are raising connects actually to the question that was just asked by Diane. And we have a short time together, so I didn't get into certain other topics. But one of the things I'd like to say relate to the point you were making actually connects to some of the work from the young man who's on the screen above you, Andrew Domzal. And that is what many of us don't realize. When I was raising that question of how coloniality and colonization work at conceptual levels, many of us don't realize that we have inherited a very problematic metaphysics through which to conduct intellectual investigation. And the problematic metaphysics is substance-based metaphysics. And substance-based metaphysics is locked into a fetishizing of ontology. Now, these are all, technical terms, but it comes down to this. It's a fetishizing of being, right? And one of the tricky things about human reality is we use the term human beings, but human beings are not properly beings. Human beings are the always transcending being. And so the effort to contain human beings into a vessel of being, that creates a lot of problems. And a lot of colonialism is premised upon the idea of containment in being. Now, there are many examples to give a critique of this, which offer in them a very different linguistic model, a different model of language itself. You can find this in the writings of Kaiji Nishitani, and Nishitani puts it very elegantly. He says the problem with a lot of Western thought is that its fetishizing of being closes off reality. Yeah, it's rather elegant, isn't it? In other words, the fetishizing of ontology gets in the way of reality because it confuses itself. Like the way I talked about liberty and freedom? It's a similar thing. A lot of people think the real is the ontological. But ontology does not encapsulate complex concepts such as meaning. The very meaning of meaning doesn't work within the idea of a reference-based ontology. But to get even deeper into the problem, of course, is that many people look at language like vessels, and that's the substance metaphysics. So the idea is to treat Western languages as broader vessels into which you place the colonized languages as tinier vessels. That's a completely distorted view of language. We don't have enough time to get into some of the details here, but a shorter way, if you look at some of the ideas from people such as Kwasi Warudo, the Ghanaian philosopher, but not just him, there are many others. We can go all the way, but not only in terms of philosophers and linguists, but you could look also to some of the insights, not only from structuralists. It's very difficult to talk about structuralism in the United States because American structuralism is the vessels model, you see? A lot of people don't understand that the radicality of structuralism is about the idea of the kind of rules or grammar that generate other rules and grammars, you see? But even if you go the way to many ancient languages had an idea that you don't talk about being by itself. You have to talk about a form of doing. In other words, you cannot be if you're not doing anything. And so there's a functional activity of language. Now, this is very important because if we think of language as what one does, what one performs, it means language functions through what could be called a relational metaphysics. And I didn't say ontology. because again, that's the encapsulating of language into being. A relational metaphysics means that there's no way in a linguistic practice that the linguistic practice can be in a relation to another linguistic practice and a new kind of linguistic relationship isn't produced. And this is very crucial because you see, part of what colonialism does is to try to break language into the logic of contraries. In other words, one complete whole that's a universal, which means a negated universal. But if you think of language dialectically, it means any interaction with a language is actually the ongoing production of language. You see what I'm saying? And this is very crucial because you already see all kinds of metaphors and metonymic examples of interaction with language that can take the form of things ranging from miscegenation to creolization, etc. I saw there's a question about creolization and hybridity. And what that is about is, you see, creolization is very different from, say, Creoles. Creoles is a kind of mixture, but creolization, creolizing is something different. It's the very antipathy of the colonial practice because colonialism requires to keep people in an apartheid separation, you see? And that's because of a fear of intimacy. You notice, and we don't have time to get to details of this, but if we grow beyond reductive disciplines, if we think of a more complex, say, form of psychoanalytical practice, Barnaby Barrett is a very brilliant psychoanalyst who looks into this issue. He's now working in South Africa. And he points out that one of the big fears of colonial practices, but also one of the big fears in certain forms of psychoanalysis, is the confusion, the effort to reduce, right, intimate life to sexual life. But erotic life is more than the question of the sexual, it's the question of the intimate, which means there's always a form of intimacy in language. This is why I was able to bring up the fact that although we're physically distant, if we're really communicating, we're actually intimate, we're connected. You see? Every time we are processing each other's ideas, for instance, it's metaphorical, but the thought we say is in us. But we need now to get rid of the vessel model of language. So once we begin to understand this, and this is something insightful that's been done not only in some of the people I talk about, but even in the country you're in, because I see your last name Nascimento, and Abdias Nascimento, as you know, thought about a lot of these issues in terms of his brand of negritude. And so what do we get from these insights? Well, as we begin to think of these insights and we begin to go backwards more, and come back to even the point about health. Because the point earlier about health was right on target. You know, one of the things that stimulated Fanon's work was actually this question. Because when Fanon was studying medicine, he was in a world of positivist medicine. Positive medicine is the vessel model. It's like there's the logical, there's the natural sciences, and the whole idea even of health was looked at in terms of physiological, neurological health. But Fanon noticed something very interesting, that it's possible to be neurologically damaged, but mentally healthy. And it's possible to be neurologically fine, but mentally unhealthy. So he meant he had to question the very concept of health. And one of the things Fanon noticed, as a good example, he made a distinction between a patient and a client. When people would consult him, he called him a client, not a patient, because he did not presuppose the person who was consulting him was suffering from mental illness. Because Fanon already determined in his studies, and this is in Panorama Blunt, but you could find it in his psychiatric writings, that a huge source of mental illness is narcissism. And he noticed that Euro-modern colonialism, and in fact, white supremacy, is actually writ large collective narcissism. Because if you think about it, if you were to pick a child and tell a child that by virtue of just simply who he or she is, he or she is superior to all other children, and that he or she has a right to everything, and that the world is unjust if he or she never gets what she wants, you are raising a narcissist. You're going to raise the most obnoxious child. But everything I just prescribed is white supremacy. That's what it is. It's to tell white people, by virtue of being white, they have a right to everything, and that the world is unjust if they don't get it. And by the way, not all people designated white accept that identity. You see what I'm getting at? But there are people who are invested in that identity, even people who are not white. And so that is an unhealthy, in the Fanonian sense, of a neurological illness premised upon narcissism. But when Fanon gets back to the patient versus the client, Fanon would ask the client, well, why are you seeing me? And if a client is saying, I am upset or I'm suffering because of a world that degrades me racially, sexually, by virtue of my gender, I am treated a certain way, the list goes on. If I am patronized at my job because of the attitude towards my identity, and the list, or if I'm exploited, blah, 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 Fanon would say, you're actually suffering because you're healthy. Think about it. What is more obscene than the happy slave? And in fact, many of the images of anti-Black racist society is to give us constant images of happy slaves. Aunt Jemima smiling, Uncle Ben so happy. Oh yeah, I just love getting whipped. Please give me the shittiest job. Oh yes, I'm a woman. Rape me whenever you can. I mean, there's something absurd about that. So Fanon makes a distinction between and Fanon's response about what he would call, in this sense, right? This critical sense, suffering because you're healthy. The right response, he says, is to be actional, because he argues that you're dealing with a structurally political problem, which means that you're never going to actually be able to live with a greater sense of meaning or respect if you're not politically active. And so he actually argues, for the sake of health, that one engage in political action. And by the way, Gabriel, another one of your countrymen, Paulo Freire, made the same argument, okay? The same argument. Because, his notion of conscientization is connected to the idea that becoming agents of the production of knowledge actually leads to greater learning, because you cannot learn with the presupposition that you're incapable of learning. And so as we begin to spread these into some of the discussions, there's something I like to say that's connected to what Sinfree and others mentioned earlier. And you notice, as I begin to deal with these concepts, even the way we think of language and ontology, as we begin to, in a way, methodically decolonizing them, but I didn't announce what that method is, because Fanon argued that the paradox of decolonization is you cannot presuppose the method as legitimate. It has to be in the practice of the method that you do it, you see? Otherwise, you fetishize the method and you're back into the disciplinary decadent practice. But one of the things that we should bear in mind as we begin to do this is we have to rethink lots of things, but as active learners. A good example is, for instance, there's certain things that are coming out as we begin to ask crucial questions. One thing, for instance, we have to rethink the very notion of slaves. Because you see, what has been handed to us is a misrepresentation of the enslaved people from Africa and in indigenous America. Because we look at them as raw material, as just basically brute labor. But that's absolutely false. The people who are enslaved from Africa were skilled labor, because they brought, under the conditions that were imposed upon them, these were people who were from their countries, who were physicians, they were soldiers, they were architects, they were farmers, they were statespeople, they were teachers. The list is very long. The material conditions of what we call the Americas, or where you are, Abiyala, were not identical to those in Northern Europe. Northern Europeans on these grounds were suffering and were dying. And the reality is that their relationship with the indigenous people and the people who were kidnapped and brought in were one in which the knowledge they produced led to the survival and the production of the very world we live in. I often say to my students, you have no idea of what your world would look like today if there were not the contributions of the African peoples enslaved and brought here, or the indigenous peoples here. Most of the world right now wouldn't be able to do just at the agricultural level without corn. Just imagine that. But if we think of many other things, the people from the very fact that the technologies we're using, if we bring gender into it, it gets even more complex. Because first of all, the technology we're using is technology dependent on filament. Filament was developed by an African American. If we go through to think about everything from the toilet to the radio, wireless technology was by a Jewish woman, Heidi Lamar. The fact that we're on the computer, we're dealing with the algorithms developed by Ada Lovelace. Okay, this is a woman who developed that system. As we go through, we have a long list of people remembered in history. People just presume the inventors have to be male. But because they've rewritten, they've put these names, you know, the presumption that they had to be male erases the females. But even more, one of the things we fail to understand is human beings are always inventing things, finding ways to transform the world. And if we understand the interactive relational model, we begin to understand that many of us are responding to reality in creative ways. Now, what this means is that it already goes to something that could be summarized beautifully by an exchange between W.B. Du Bois and Franz Boas. A lot of people today are slowly beginning to realize that we have adopted a lot of problematic anthropological models based upon the notion of origins and purity. I teach a course called Race and the Formation of Human Sciences, where I talk about this, where a lot of bad conceptions, a lot of misrepresentations of the history of our species come from the presumption of an original whiteness. And because of that, but here's the problem. Not only does it go against the grain of the actual fact that a lot of physical or biological reality is based upon genetic diversity. So there's no original purity, so to speak. But what's even more amusing is that all the evidence is showing that the people we call white people morphologically are very new. Even in Europe 10,000 years ago, there were no white people, morphological white people. But that's a longer story to deal with. It's connected to lots of things that turn to agriculture and lots of other resources. But a lot of people we just call white people there are just lightened up African peoples. Okay, just lightened up dark peoples. But here's the crucial thing. Du Bois had asked Boas to speak at the commencement at Atlanta University on race. And Boas said, you know, they could read my writings on race. I want to talk in African history. And Du Bois was shocked. He was like, what do you mean African history? Because you see, Du Bois himself, despite all of his effort as a race man to fight for Black liberation, etc., still bought into the logic of Europeans as having civilized Africans. He bought into the logic that white is right, and the project is to just show that they're exceptional Blacks. That's why there was a talented tent model. And Boas said, most of the human species, most of the history of the human species is African. That means most of the great revolutions, from the development of language to the whole way in which we are to deal with food, trade, etc., took place in Africa. The recent, a lot of recent revolutions are just tweaking these fundamental revolutions that come out of the symbolic life of our species. So ultimately, one of the biggest damages from colonialism, Boas argued, is for Black students to believe that history itself is through the grace, the gifts of Europeans, of whites. He says it's just false. And if they could understand Black people as agents of history, and they could understand that all white people are just people who entered the participation of history, then there would be a different path that could be taken, and this would be healthier for those graduating students at Atlanta University. Now, of course, today, there are people who make that argument who are called Afrocentrics, Afroecologists, and so forth, and they're attacked without people reading their work. But actually, a lot of these ideas were being argued by actually white thinkers in the 19th century who were starting from just trying to learn about the past if they read South Asian or African thought without a racial imposition onto it, whether it's Gerald Massey in the UK, all the way through to quite a few others. Now, why this is crucial is that once we begin to understand that itself was not only a decolonial practice, but you could see how that steps outside of problematic standpoint racial paradigms. Because at this moment, the critical question is something brings out what Black studies, what Africana studies actually brings, that is actually the true challenge. See, a lot of people would prefer to fetishize challenge of mimesis, of whether you could say, well, this is the Black version of what the white folks are doing. And then in the Black version, you get to see blackface, but ultimately on white ideas. That actually would make the masters sleep well at night. But actually, the project is a very different one, because I've always argued what Africana philosophy, Africana thought, or if we look through what was developed by people like Aurobindo in India, or if we even think about some of the ideas of Swami Vivekananda, or all the way through to some of the people I talked about, like Nishitani, is what they're actually saying is that if you get out of that metaphysics, if you get out of that colonial practice, ultimately the relationality, the transdisciplinarity brings truth. You see, the biggest fear is of what many of you in the room do, actually to be an intellectual enterprise. They would like it to be reduced to the stereotypes of what they call identity politics, which I think is an oxymoron for a variety of reasons that I can't get into here. But what they would like it to believe is that we're narcissistically looking for our own image. But what we're actually doing is saying the narcissism has been in the image of a colonial university and that it's impeding truth. So actually what we're arguing for is for a more robust effort to transcend those silos, those stratificating practices into actual forms of transcendence, transcending practices that are truth functioning. Now, once we think in that way, that means then that we're producing not only new ideas, but we don't even know what different kinds of disciplines may come out of them. And what would happen with disciplines if they come not as closed disciplines, but as opportunities for developing more rich, multidimensional relationships with reality. And I give you an example of this. Some of the physicists, and this is not to fetishize physics, it's just that I'm usually called in because there's some people just like the way I think. And they say, let's hang out, Louis, and be part of the team, and we'll see what happens. But I work with people, for instance, who try to theorize in 18 dimensions. Now, for many of you, if I say 18 dimensions, you're thinking, what the hell is that? Because many of you think of dimensions spatially, and that's part of the problem. Many of us don't realize that dimensionality could be non-spatial. So for instance, mind could be a dimension, language could be a dimension, whatever discloses certain meaning functions that open up reality in different ways can be dimensions. And so what happens is when some people thematize or theorize mathematically in 18 dimensions, at first, their first point is, well, the mathematics add up, but what the hell are we talking about? But what's strange is as they begin to communicate with each other, they begin to see, and I have to say it out metaphorically, see the different things they're talking about that are not at the moment communicable to others because they're not gone through the functional practices of attempting to speak in those ways. And a lot of us don't realize that a lot of what we do today would be opaque to people of the past because the conditions of possibility for our speech is connected to everything from different kinds of math, to different kinds of relations, to different kinds of identity, to different kinds of language, etc. And so if we come back then to an insight, and I love this from Kwasi Wirudu, if you think about that old model of language, that is the vessel model, then I bring my language, you bring your language, and we see how they match up. But the problem with that is that I would have to treat my language as ontologically complete. But that would mean the experiential basis through which my language was generated had to have encapsulated all possible reality, which is false. However, what happens, Wirudu points out, is that often when people with different languages, and the linguistics could attest to this, meet, they may start with pairing, but they realize there are things that don't pair up, that there's actually an absence of isomorphism. And what happens in that case when you're meeting people in a language that has grammatical structures and terms that just don't have any correlate in your language? What do? And the answer is very straightforward. You learn it. And what's interesting is as you learn it, your practice and that they're learning it begins to produce things in language that become so at home in the language that people don't even realize that it was external originally to that language. Nobody in the English language realizes today that soda is Arabic, as an example. Or other examples is the way it functions with us in terms of language acquisition. When I was a child, I was fortunate. I was born in a large extended family. And again, this is a big distinction, you're right. We have had imposed upon us the normativity of the nuclear bourgeois family, but in many African and Asian communities, and because I'm from a family in the Caribbean that were African and Asian, and there were European, Scottish, and Irish, and there were Palestinian Jews and Irish Jews and Chinese from Guangdong and Tamils from, that's why I spoke in Tamil, from Pondicherry, India. It meant the child, when my mother brought me home, was in a complex linguistic environment. So as a child, I learned Cantonese. But the thing about it, and Jamaican patois is full of creolization of West African languages as well. And so when you put that together, although my memories now are more in patois and English, it's striking when I go into environments where there are people who, say, speak Mandarin, because they're shocked that I could hear sounds that native English speakers cannot hear. And when I try to speak with them, they're shocked because you see, again, if I'm imitating them, then I should, if I'm a good imitator, I should sound Mandarin. But they always stop and they say, you speak Mandarin in a Cantonese accent. Do you see where I'm getting at? So that grammatical question of communication is something that's very crucial because it means even when I try to speak the other languages, for instance, Gabriel could tell immediately the way I said Bamzia is a little different because it brings in certain Ghanaian inflections from Jamaica. But the point is, these are ways in which we actually have the capacity for communication that's far more than the more colonial practices of learning to which we adhere. I remember when I first went to Cuba, I went and hung out in the streets with some kids, we were just walking around. And by the end of the day, I was speaking Cubano. And when we went to our meetings, the translator hadn't showed up and we were waiting, and so I just asked the person, and so I became the translator for our group. Now, the thing about it is, I'm sure, and I can say with absolute certainty, I wasn't at all doing any perfect Cubano. I mean, they would say Spanish, but it wasn't perfect at all. But communication is always an imperfect art. You see, it's always an ongoing practice to communicate better. And that is, if we bring what I just said as an allegory of decolonization, we can understand that this works with our disciplines. This works all the way through even to our political practices. because they're replete with contingency. And what is fundamentally at work is the question of a commitment to making things work. You see what I'm saying? If I just sat with those kids in Cuba, or when I go to other places with the idea that they have to meet me on my terms, that is colonial. But if I accept the idea that I would be vulnerable, open, and imperfect, then practices of connecting and communicating begin. And we build from there. And I see that as part of our task, especially as learners. And one last point there, just a little point, connected back to what was said earlier about markets. You see, ironically, there's a market colonization of markets. Because you see, humanity's markets go back 150,000 years. And you notice I said it in plural, markets. All markets are places in which when people meet, there is exchange. Not for profit, but exchange. Ancient humanity got news through meeting other human beings. And the news they brought back was the exchange. You see? Technologies were exchanged, learning was exchanged. Sometimes what is exchanged is actual biological material. But in the end, the plurality was a very human practice. That's how people got news. And most markets, even today, if you go all over Africa, the Caribbean, and a lot of parts of South America, are actually woman governed. And that's connected to a whole complex issue about how language is acquired. However, what capitalism basically said is that one has to subordinate markets to a concept called the market. And Euromodern capitalism with the market then fetishizes the market like a god. In other words, a decadence of the market. And in that space, the market has to become ontological, omniscient, omnipresent, complete. And that's why the market, in order to function as the market, must commodify all markets. And hence, this is why it becomes a dehumanizing practice. The problem under Euromodern capitalism of markets is that they are too human. And this is why capitalism is fundamentally a dehumanizing practice. It is to subordinate humanity under the rationalization of profit as the teleological model, instead of the communicative practices that have within them the resistance of erotic connection and intimacy of meaning. And so anyway, I know we went over time, but thank you all. As we don't have to stop here, as we said, we could continue communicating. So write me, and I'm sure we'll meet up again. And I'm looking forward to also reading some of the work a lot of you all are doing. It is exciting, and thank you.
Louis, before you go, Ronke has a question that she wants to ask. Ronke, where is Ronke? Ronke said she had a question.
I believe she might have left.
She might have left. Oh, okay.
Did you write the question down?
No, she simply said she had a question. And then Marie Hanida, you said you had a question about what?
The term transcendent. So maybe I'm reading too much Deleuze and Guattari. I'm reading what is philosophy. So your talk really resonated with the idea of concept formation and the importance of producing. But in their terms, transcendence is this static place where the becoming is not possible. So like transcend has a connotation to me, something very Cartesian. And I just wondered if you have any thought about it.
I do. Thank you for that. I'm not using it in their sense. One of my criticisms of a lot of post-structuralists is that they have an embedded Eurocentrism. I'm actually using it in the most mundane sense of just simply going beyond, reaching beyond. That's all.
Okay.
Yeah. So my sense. That's why I also, when I said teleological, I said small t. I just use the term, but I mean it just in the sense of having an aim or a purpose,
Okay.
but not a closed one. And the reason Guattari and Deleuze were able to make their position is because they are, and I agree with them with the critique of Cartesianism, because Cartesianism is actually based on a substance metaphysics. And because it's a substance metaphysics, it has this effort to reach a kind of completeness of being. And this is right, which of course, as human beings are unfulfillable. And that's why their critique is correct. But the model I'm arguing is not Cartesian at all. In fact, I see it as actually coming from a basis of thinking of more dynamic languages through which, for instance, we think of terms that are constantly functioning the way I used the metaphor of openings. But that's an act. You notice I moved my hand, right? And so I'm being critical of any model that wants the outcome before the performance. But the performance is actually a performing. And that's why in a lot of my analyses, I tend to use present tense participles, but I don't want to lock the present into a present centrism, because the present becomes incoherent then, because all a presenting is a form of anticipatory practice that's always transformed, precisely because for the present to make sense, one has to find oneself having a possibility. This is, of course, one of the damages done by colonialism, because what colonialism imposes upon indigenous peoples and also imposes upon racialized peoples is the idea that they only belong, so to speak, to the past. And as a consequence, if you only belong to the past, then you have delegitimated your present because of the absence of an anticipatory activity through which you could have a future. So this is why the transformation, all decolonial practices, all decolonizing practices are practices in which one gets rid of the melancholia of non-belonging through actually letting go of the idea of permanence and the idea of the production of a relationship of possibility that goes beyond the self. And that's why even models of love in those practices are different. Colonial love is narcissistic. It comes down to I love you because you're like me. So I'm looking for the reproduction of myself. Radical love is different. I have the ability to love you with you not being like me, but through the celebration of your freedom, of the possibilities of what you may offer, without it having to be a rationalization for me. And this is one of the reasons why with radical love, we're able to actually go beyond the idea of the exclusively human. We're living in a world right now, for instance, we're taking very seriously the question of what it is to love things that are non-human. And take that very seriously as part of our ethical responsibility of radical acts of love. But that's related to that. But it's connected in a way, because if we're wedded to Cartesian metaphysics, which is substance metaphysics, which is linked into Aquinas, which goes all the way back to Aristotle, etc., we fail to understand that that's only a tiny fragment of how humanity has thought. If we were to look at what may happen, for instance, in the concept of Unum, which interestingly enough is one of the basis that tends to use metaphors of water, which is one of the reasons why Unum links to Noah, which in the language of Medu Neter became foundational, linked into Hebrew, which is why in mythological form, it takes the form of water. And that's why it's one of the foundations of the name Noah. And that's why you could tell the story of Noah in the Bible is linked to the ark and water. But that's the term that's often translated to link to the notion of existence. You don't have the term that would have a kind of static substance being in that language, because for that language, that makes no sense at all. It has to being by virtue of doing what? You see? And so similarly, right, if we're talking about our disciplines, if we fetishize our disciplines, we substantialize them in the form of the metaphysics of substance. But if we get rid of that, then we have the interactive, communicative, transcending, in the sense of beyond communicative practices through which we can actually now deal with working together towards the question of what we're trying to build and understand. But also, in some cases, it does not have to have a concluding teleological purpose. And again, we're running out of time, but a very simple example of this, two very simple examples. No, three. One, poetry, right? Two, the very point about symbolic life. If we eradicate intellectual work, scientific thinking, philosophical thinking, and a lot of those, as done properly, if they look like government manuals, okay? The journal article, you know, the way the treatise is to look. What we begin to realize is that we can speak across generations better, more creatively, if we use the resources that tend to bring the form of symbolic life through which people can contribute to the conversation. Ali Shariati summarizes it very well in Islam and Man when he points out that the symbolic tends to work better because the idea of the reductive languages tend to be so fixed to the specific that when their times change, they lose their relevance. This is why a lot of African philosophy, a lot of Asian philosophy, and a lot of indigenous philosophy is also done through allegory and proverbs, not out of any romantic notions of what they are, but it's because in the act of using allegorical and metaphorical language, one is admitting that no linguistic moment fully contains reality. And that is why others are able to come in and contribute. Why we talk about Plato today as an example is because Plato was not exclusively propositional in his discourse. Plato was also allegorical, poetic. Why we talk about Fanon? There were other people who were Black post-colonial psychiatrists and activists, but Fanon is aphoristic, allegorical, metaphorical, which means that we have to bring something in our effort to learn Fanon. And there are many examples of those. And so that means we have to be willing to get rid of the fetishism, the market commodification of knowledge in how we present ideas in order for ideas actually to be more richly communicated across the globe. And it doesn't mean that it's going to be universal in a fixed sense, but it's participatory in that more people are able to participate and contribute to it. And I get to the last part. I said a lot about language, but you notice something about language a lot of people don't mention? Most of the time we're speaking, we're not actually trying to make a point. Think about the times when you meet somebody, you take a walk. You don't know in advance sometimes where the walk would lead to, the outcome of the conversation. And so conversing, actual linguistic participation, not discursive participation, is not entirely about propositional fixed meaning. It is the actual activity of living together. And in that, it means there really are times when somebody says, what are you all talking about? There are times where it's true when you say nothing. And for some people, that's really perplexing because their response is, why the hell are you talking if you're talking about nothing? But there's a lot more going on with nothing than we may realize. But that would require a lot more time beyond, and we're already much over time. So thank you all for me getting to spend some time with you. Okay. So now I have, Jane and I, we have to go pick up our son.
Okay,
Right?
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for this fascinating discussion. Vishna will just tell us about the next session. Is Vishna around? Mm-hmm. No, okay, right.
Well, very briefly to all of you, what I want to say is continue being safe and healthy and find moments of joy. It'll remind you of your humanity.
Yeah.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye, everybody. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Thank you very much to everybody for attending.
Ciao.
Yeah, ciao. Yes. Our next session is going to be with Linda Smith, who is a Maori scholar who wrote this famous book on decolonizing research methods. So it will be a very interesting transition from Gordon to Linda Smith in light of the critique on methodology that Gordon was making, where methodology may constitute a strategic effort to run away from reality. So it will be interesting to hear what Linda Smith will be talking about. But I think the time, I can't remember what time it is going to be. It's likely to be in the afternoon because it has to be early for her. She will be in New Zealand, right? So I hope to be able to see you there because then we're going to be focusing on methodology, and the discussion of methodology after listening to Gordon will be a very interesting one to hear what she has to talk about. Right. Okay, Magda and Raphael, do you have anything to say? Sally, thanks a lot for stepping in and summarizing and getting engaged with Gordon. Right. Raphael, do you have anything you want to say?
I just wanted to thank everyone for participating, asking questions, and commenting. It's enriched our discussion, and I hope you're living with some sustenance so that we can continue to fight the good fight. Yes, yes. At least this time you didn't have the problem of being told that you haven't read the book, so that rhetoric was not there. So, okay.
You are funny, Sunfree. You are funny.
Yeah, okay. Thanks a lot, guys. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thanks to everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
See you on March 27th with Linda Smith.
Yeah, March 27th.
Thanks,
Linda
Professor
Smith.
Sinfree Marconi.
Oh, okay. See, cheers.